G'day all. So with my recent return back to Australia, I decided to take a trip down to the National Motor Racing Museum in Bathurst, located next to the world famous Mount Panorama racing circuit, and just have a look at some of the cars they got on display, like some of the racing cars, motorbikes, and other racing memorabilia they got. So I decided to make a day trip out of it and just discuss some of these cars and talk about their overall history in racing, and yeah, just have a look around and show you what the museum has to offer. Hope you enjoy. So here we are at the National Motor Museum, and I've got right here next to me a 1965 Ford Cortina GT500, named the GT500 after the Armstrong 500 race it competed in at Bathurst. And basically this one here is considered, and if not it's considered, it's listed as the oldest winning car at Bathurst on display here at the Motor Museum. Now, these came out, produced around about 98 horsepower, and it was said about 247 of these were produced and roughly about 50 remain. And this one here is a great example of just how the motor industry, the motor racing really kicked off back then. Although it wasn't Australian built, this here was just showing where the motor racing was going in, mostly at Bathurst. In front of me here is the 1967 Ford Falcon XB GT. And what's relevant about this car in particular, this was the first model GT introduced into Ford Australia. This is the car that basically Ford Australia wanted to show off at Mount Panorama and show off in the touring car. And this came with a 289 V8, which at the time was quite impressive and did produce a top speed of around about 190 kilometers per hour. This was that a few models before what would become the GTHO. This was more or less the predecessor of the GTHO as is, but this was the first introduced Ford Falcon GT. So here we are standing in front of the 1970 XW GTHO Phase 2, the famous Ford Falcon XW Phase 2. And these cars here were basically built to compete on Mount Panorama here at Bathurst. And unlike the Phase 1, which originally came with a 5.8 litre Windsor, these were then upgraded to the 5.8 litre 351 Cleveland V8 engine. Although it didn't dominate as much as its XY follow-up, the Phase 2 itself was an impressive performance vehicle at the time. Just, it was that one or two step away from getting over the line and dominating at Bathurst. But unfortunately, due to technical issues, it wasn't exactly where it needed to be at that moment of development. So it wasn't until 1971 when the XY was introduced where the GTHO series really became dominant, really just went all out and became world famous. Now, these examples here are now going at auction for astronomical prices. The Phase 3, for example, has been said to sell over 1 million Australian dollars. And due to their low numbers, it's becoming one of those things where just every year they're just getting more and more pricey. And although the XW is not as, it's not as desirable as the XY would become, they still demand a high price. And these cars here, the XYs and the XWs, really epitomize the muscle car era of the 1970s. And even to this day, they do become that one car that a lot of people are always drawn to. And just looking at now with this rumble red paint scheme, these cars were made famous by Alan Moffat and Fred Gibson when they were driven at Bathurst and they were driven around the Australian touring circuit. But even just looking at it now, it's just amazing to look at. And over here we've got the famous Ford hardtops now in line and ready to be discussed about. And what we got here is the John Goss, Kevin Bartlett 1974 XA GT. So it was around about this time where the XA GTHO Phase 4 was being developed. And this was said to be the car that was gonna basically crack the 160 mile per hour speed limit. And this more or less was what got the government a bit concerned about these homologated cars, these street legal cars you could buy off the lot that could do speeds that could exceed those kind, that could do like 200 kilometers an hour at least. And that more or less killed the GTHO Phase 4. So what eventually did happen is, although Ford discontinued the development of the GTHO racing package, they decided to do something a bit interesting where they would sell all these parts that they already had ready for these cars, and they'd sell them in sort of like a dealership backdoor way or backlot way. And you can get a selection of these parts through the dealership under the famous RPO 83 package, which was more or less a GTHO Phase 4, but just not in name. And with this entry here in the John Goss, Kevin Bartlett XA Special GT, it really showed off at Bathurst. It really showed off at the racing circuit just how nice these coupes were and how more or less they became now one of the most desirable cars in people's collection. So anyone who ever goes for like auction, they just always covet these two-door coupes. And although they're a bit of a mix of like, especially more or less with the XB that we're going to discuss later, although they're a bit of a mix of like the Ford Mustang, the Mark I, and the Gran Torino of the time, they do have their own style to it. And a lot of Americans, for example, have always been upset that these cars in particular never got exported to the US. But when these were shown off at Bathurst, they really stood out more than anything else. I mean, you got the bigger wheel arches at the back that allowed for much wider tyres for better gripping. And again, equipped with the still famous 351 Cleveland V8 engine, said with the RPO 83 at least, they were producing around about at least 300 plus horsepower. Like there's no real determined what exactly horsepower these things were going. So anywhere between 350, 400, it's roughly around that area. But again, it's just a sight to behold, these cars. A treat for Holden fans, next to me here is the 1974 Holden LH Torana SLR 5000. The LH Torana was produced from 1974 to 1976, and this Torana in particular has got a little bit of infamy where it was famously seen with 4 laps to go in its last race in Bathurst, producing a lot of smoke due to the fact that the oil seal, the gearbox oil seal had cracked and it was leaking onto the clutch. And it was questioned whether or not it was going to cross the finish line. But luckily enough, driven by John Fitzpatrick and Bob Morris, this car was able to cross the finish line regardless of its gearbox and other issues. But again, it remains one of those little bit of a nice little presentation of that era, considering the smoke that it was producing, and not many people were sure it was going to cross the line. So a personal favorite of mine has always got to be the Ford Falcon XB GT hardtop. And anyone who watches the channel knows the reason for this is this was the car that Mel Gibson drove in the famous Mad Max series, the original Pursuit Special, the black on black. It's just, ever since I saw that car as a kid, I've just always, always wanted one for myself. I never got around to it, but who knows. But again, this car in particular is a 1975 XB GT hardtop. And this was run privately in the race by John Goss again and Kevin Bartlett. Now, this car would be later donated to Alan Moffat in 1976 after his transporter and race car was stolen just before the Adelaide round. And he went to have several victories with his car, and eventually he would get his second title championship thanks to this XB here. Now the XB itself was that little bit of an extra upgrade from the XA, obviously. It was the next in the series. And the XB is more or less, it's always debated which one is the more preferred, and the XB was that little bit upgrade from the XA for several reasons. Like, it was the first car, the first Falcon at least, to include 4-wheel disc brakes, and it came once again with the 351 Cleveland, the 5.8 litre V8. This was, unfortunately, this model, the XB, Falcon XB, was the last model of the GT range, where again it was going back to the whole insurance issues where people were concerned because the insurance rating was going up, that even Ford itself underrated these cars in the horsepower division. So the GTs were around about, the XB GT was around about 300 to 350 horsepower at that point. And again, this is more or less the last of that era. This was, the GT was the last of that range that started with the XR. But these cars themselves, thanks to Mad Max and thanks to now their scarcity, are becoming more and more the cars that people want. And a lot of these cars, especially the XBs, are being exported even to the US, where a number of fans are converting these hardtops to look just like the black on black, the Pursuit Special. And this was the second to last of the hardtop series, but this was the last of the GTs. So here we've got a Bathurst icon, the 1977 Ford Falcon XC GS, driven by Alan Moffat, and was made famous in that spectacular photo, that 1-2 photo finish of the two Fords crossing the finish line at Bathurst, the Hardy Ferodo 1000. and with the second car being driven by Colin Bond. Now this car initially started life as an XB back in 1976, so it was around about this time in 1977 where the XC was being introduced, and it was the last of the Falcon hardtops. And it was around about this time where they upgraded they gave it a facelift to more or less match the XC, because at that stage the XCs themselves weren't fully ready for racing. But this car itself, again, it was the last of that iconic image of the hardtops, the 1970s Ford hardtops. And it wouldn't prove to be the end of an era, because after this, Ford Australia had never reproduced, or they would never produce another two-door hardtop ever again. And this model and design, again, it goes back to the XA and the XB, still remains iconic. It still remains a car that many people desire. And although the GT model itself was no longer in existence, due to the fact that people were afraid of what was going on with the insurers, because every time the insurance company would see like GT on the badge, they'd always like jack up the prices. So a lot of these car manufacturers now were trying to avoid, you know, names like a GT or SS. And although personally I'm not the biggest fan of the XC facelift, to be honest, but still these cars themselves, how can you go wrong? Next to me is the highlight of the National Motor Museum, the 1984 Holden Commodore VK, driven by Peter Brock and Jeff Perkins. And this car here was considered, or has been given the title, the last of the big bangers. With the 5-litre V8 said to be producing around 400 brake horsepower, this car itself was said to have a top speed of around 280 to 290 kilometers per hour. And just to see it, it does sort of represent that muscle car era. Like, I mean, touring car racing continued with the VL Commodore and several Falcons and so forth. But this was one of the last iconic cars that famed Aussie race car legend Peter Brock drove. And it carried, of course, his number 05, which was a throwback to his support in the then, or even still, the 0.5 like alcohol limit. Like, so he was very much against drink driving, and part of that was represented by his 05 number in his car. But because there could not be a number under 1 in terms of the racing division, you could never have anything less than 1. They removed the dash, they removed the dot, and it just became the 05. And that's the number that Brock became famous for. And ever since his death back in 2006, the number has been retired in respect to Peter Brock himself. But again, it's just a wonderful car. You can't go wrong with it. A little treat you'll find here at the National Motor Racing Museum, which although houses a number of racing cars and what other main attractions, what have you, they do have a nice collection of motorcycles here. And one of the highlights here of that collection, of the motorcycle collection, is the 1987 Honda NSR 500 ridden by Wayne Gardner. Now, this was the bike that was ridden to victory in the 1987 500cc World Championship in Brazil, which made Gardner the first Australian to win a 500cc Grand Championship. Now, the bike itself was kindly loaned by Gardner, and it is a throwback to one of those time periods in the 90s where these bikes in particular, these racing bikes, had that lovely appeal to them. And a lot of people still covet these bikes. They're so nice to look at, and you just can't get enough of them. So this bike itself, being at 500 cc's, is a 2-stroke with 160 horsepower. And again, I can only just imagine racing one of these professionally on track. But what can you say? Like, Wayne Gardner himself had an interesting career, went on to even become like race car driver himself, and even competed at Le Mans at one point in his career. Just amazing.
So as you can see, there are a lot more vehicles to come down and look at here at the museum, as we only got a chance to talk about a few of them, as its lineup is constantly changing, as there are a number of people who continue to donate their vehicles to be put here on display at the museum. So there's always another reason to come down and have a look at every now and again. And I highly recommend, if you've never done so, to come down and take a look, as there's just something for everyone, and I really enjoyed myself. Special shout out to Museum Coordinator Brad Owen, who allowed me the opportunity to come down and discuss and film some of these cars. And also a special shout out to my cousin John and his daughter Katerina, who helped with the filming and line reading of the video, and who were also kind enough to drive me down to the museum. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care. Cheers. Bye.